Here we have another governmental question, and I want to use this question to give you another tool to answering questions. This was a sentence incomplete sentence question. We're trying to fill out the rest of that sentence. And so the technique I want you to use is to come back and reread that question stem. It's so short for each and every one of these answer choices. And you should do that when you're finding yourself in a question where it feels like the answer choices are feeling like they're running together in your mind and you need to separate them out and consider them separately. So let's practice that technique with this question. In an audit of compliance with requirements for a governmental program, a test of controls need not be performed if the controls are expected to be operationally ineffective. Well, we know that to be true, I like that answer, but I want us to practice this procedure with B, C, and D before we get too far into A. In an audit of compliance with requirements for a governmental program, a test of controls need not be performed if substantive procedures alone do not provide sufficient appropriate evidence. And what you should think to yourself is that, wait, what if substantive procedures are unable to provide sufficient appropriate evidence? Well, tests of controls are necessary, not need to be performed. I need to perform them. So I'm going to eliminate B, and I'm going to use this technique of rereading the question for C. In an audit of compliance with requirements for a governmental program, you can read it faster every time, a test of controls need not be performed if it is required by a governmental audit requirement. See, the practice of rereading the question makes C seem like a what? That's not right. If it's required by a governmental audit, if it's a governmental audit requirement, then the auditor must comply. So by rereading that question stem, it makes some of these answer choices feel like, obviously, that's not an answer. In an audit of compliance with requirements for a governmental program, a test of controls need not be performed if they are not required by a governmental audit requirement. Well, tests of controls are required without a governmental audit requirement if substantive procedures are inadequate or the risk assessment is based on an expectation of operating effectiveness. So this one is not quite as obvious as the last two, but remember that tests of controls are required without a governmental audit requirement if substantive procedures are inadequate or risk assessment is based on an expectation of operating effectiveness. Speaking of operating effectiveness, remember that when tests of controls would support the position that controls are operating effectively, then they should be performed. But tests of controls need not be performed if the controls are expected to be operationally ineffective. In fact, tests of controls should be performed if the auditor's risk assessment includes an expectation of operating effectiveness. This is ineffective, so we did not need to perform them. Substantive procedures alone do not provide sufficient appropriate evidence, or the tests of controls over compliance are required by a governmental audit requirement. I always remember this test of control requirement by the idea that if the controls are you already know they're operationally ineffective, you're going to have to assess that control risk without tests of controls to inform your other audit procedures effectively. Best answer choice is A, the controls are expected to be operationally ineffective. One of the things I want you to take away from this is not just the content, but also the idea that you can solve for questions effectively by rereading the question stem and when it's an incomplete sentence.